Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me here for week seven. Week seven, 7 weeks we've been doing this. Better understand the Bible. The penultimate week. Penultimate's one of my favorite words, meaning second to last. Next week we'll be talking about Revelation, which is an amazing book. It's the only time throughout this series we're going to have one class on one specific book, but Revelation is so much different than any of the other books that I think it deserves that little week to itself. Tonight, we're talking about the epistles. We're talking about everything essentially between the book of Acts and Revelation. There are 21 letters that have become scripture in the Bible. And the fact that they're letters are going to be a very, very important thing to understand in terms of how we go about interpreting them, how we go about reading them. So we'll start with an overview. Again, 21 letters to and from churches, mostly around the Mediterranean area. This is the spread of Christianity around the Mediterranean, that story that we saw in Acts of Paul planting churches around that area. Now you have Paul and various apostles writing letters to and from those churches, and those letters have become these epistles, these scriptures. And in much the same way that the wisdom literature, when we talked about that, was people trying to work out how to practically follow the laws and the way the teachings of Moses and God in the Torah. These letters give us a window into how the early church was trying to work out the teachings of Jesus, how they were trying to live out this idea of Christianity and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus in this first century. And I think one of the most beneficial things of reading through the epistles is that we come to understand that as much as we struggle here in the 21st century with trying to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus and how that affects our lives and how we change our posture towards people and things in life based upon being a follower of Jesus. These folks that were right there in the early church that actually had access to either Jesus himself or to Jesus's apostles and followers were having many of the same struggles, or some, and in some cases worse struggles than the things that we wrestle with today. So it's really interesting to look at it that way, to read these letters as a window into how were people immediately in that adjacent period of time to Jesus's life trying to work out and be Christians, be followers of Jesus. So context is critical when we go through the apostles. There's a lot of amazing theology in these letters, but the context of these letters sort of dictates whether that theology is universal, whether it's for all time and for everybody, or whether it's time and place specific. Even in the time and place specific things, there's things that we can learn, but we apply that stuff differently than we would things that we consider to be universal. So when we talk about authorship of the epistles, Paul is credited with authoring 13 of the 21 epistles. But just as we've seen with previous books or previous sections of the Bible, a lot of times when a letter is credited to Paul, it may have been written actually by somebody else and they're using his name. Maybe they were a student of his or a compatriot of his. Maybe they were expressing teachings that he had taught them. But of the 13, there's only a few that we know for sure, or we believe we know for sure that Paul wrote. I'll talk about those in a little bit. But Paul is credited with 13 of them. John wrote 3, Peter 2, James 1, and Jude 1, and that leaves one left, which is the book of Hebrews, which nobody really knows who wrote it. There are some scholars that believe that Paul wrote the letter of Hebrews. There's some Pauline sounding phrasing in the letter to the Hebrews, but there's also a lot of other stuff that doesn't sound like Paul at all. And so for the most part, scholars just credit Hebrews as an anonymous letter, but that runs you through the authorship. When we're talking about type of literature, well, yeah, obviously we're talking about a letter, and that sounds simple, but it's important. It's important for a couple of reasons. One is it gives us an idea of the structure that we're going to be running into. There are certain things that are common to most, though not all, of these letters. They generally start with the name of the writer. Obviously, that doesn't happen in Hebrews. And then who are they writing to? The name of the recipient, whether it's an individual or whether it's a church. Then there's some form of greeting, and then some form of prayer or thanksgiving, then the body of the letter, and then some sort of final greeting and farewell. Now, again, some of those elements are missing from some letters, but that gives you a general flow of how these letters are structured. It also tells you where things are in terms of importance. Something in the body of the letter, that's probably going to be the most important stuff. The closer to the front of the letter it is, the closer to the very end of the letter it is, kind of the less important those things could be. And in that case, if you're seeing some sort of theological idea there, it's much less likely to be universal if it's in those front or back sections of it. It also contextualizes when we deal with the fact that we're dealing with letter. It gives us context, right? Because when we're reading through these epistles, before we make any grand conclusions at all, we have to ask ourselves a series of questions. One, when was this epistle written? What was the historical period in which this epistle was written? Two, to whom was it written? Because who you're writing to will very much influence the things that you say. Why was it written? What was the occasion of the writing of this letter? And then what else was going on in that area or in that time period or in this relationship between the person who was writing the letter and the person who's receiving the letter? What else was going on? When you go through that series of questions, it gives you context, which you can then apply to these things. And again, this goes to this notion of whether the theology in here is universal. Does it apply to everybody and for all time? Or whether it is time and place specific? If you know the time and you know the place, then it's much easier to pick out which of those things tend to be more time and place specific. That's a lot of information to come up with. And when you look at your standard Bible, most of that information isn't contained in there necessarily. So how are we supposed to know these things, right? Well, you can go to seminary. You know all these books back here, and that tells you all that stuff. Most people obviously aren't going to do that. What we generally recommend is a good study Bible, and I've got one up over in the corner there. That kind of bluish green looking book is the NIV study Bible, and there's plenty of different versions of study Bibles out there. Some of them are far better than others, but in a general sense, what the study Bibles do is give you at least a brief rundown of this kind of information. And they do it for all the books, really. They give you a little bit of history, a little bit about the authorship, a little bit about what was going on. They provide context for these books, and they're tremendous resources. There are also commentaries out there. Actually, both of these two shelves are strictly are commentaries, and so is this one back up over here. That one back up over there is mostly actually from those red books to that pink book there-ish are commentaries based on the lectionary. So when I'm preaching at Genesis, those are the first thing I go to, is to figure out, what week I'm preaching and where the text is. And then those give you ideas of what's going on in that text specific to the lectionary texts, which is tremendously, tremendously helpful. That's a lot of stuff to go through, and most people aren't going to look into those books too. There's some great electronic versions too that are far cheaper. But really, I steer people towards study Bibles more than anything to get just a brief idea of that context there. It also, there's a couple of points there. One is that when someone is telling you that Paul or John or Peter is clearly saying this, one of the first questions that should be asking yourself is, what is that person's credentials? Have they been to seminary? Have they, done this kind of work? And then how are they contextualizing that information? If it's somebody you trust, if it's a preacher you've been around in the past and you have a lot of a relationship with, great. But it never hurts to go back to one of these study Bibles or do a commentary if you've got access to them and just kind of double check the information. What did I hear in this sermon? What other people have to say about these things? Nobody has it all right. So it's always okay to ask questions and to go deeper and to dig into some other materials. Also, again, as we keep saying, when you're trying to decide if something is universal or if something is time and place specific, context is everything. Now, if you can't, go through all these resources, there are other ways to look at it as well. The first thing that I tell people to do is go back to the Gospels. Because if Jesus said something similar to what's being said in these letters, well, then you're probably on the right track. However, if Jesus said something that seems on the surface to contradict something said in these letters, well, Jesus is our primary source, right? Jesus comes first. Jesus comes before Paul. Sometimes the church gets those two kind of backwards. They take something that Paul said and try to make something Jesus said fit what Paul said. And that generally is a backwards way to go. But if it's something that Jesus hadn't talked about, well, okay, that gives us maybe a clue about how relatively important it is. But we can still compare to the rest of the New Testament. We can compare to what other authors are saying. Are other letter writers saying something similar to what we're reading in this whatever particular epistle that we're in? If so, if there's that consistency there, that gives us a pretty good idea that this is an important concept and something that may have a more universal bent to it. And we can also go back to the Old Testament. We've been through all of those books and we have an idea of what they were talking about and why they were talking about it. So how does what this New Testament author say, does that resonate with things that I've read in the Psalms, or does that compare to something that I read in some of the prophetic texts? If you start to see those connections there, that gives you a pretty good idea, again, that we're dealing with something perhaps more universal and less time and space specific. So the context, the idea of it being a letter is very important. And it means that we have to be discerning about what's in there being theology for all time or something that this person wanted to say to this church because of this reason. And those can be different things. Historically, you can find lists of timelines all over the place. There is no one simple correct timeline. I did pull up one that I'll share with you here that gives you just a basic idea of when some of these letters were written. And this also has the Gospels mixed in with it. And we talked about last week with the Gospels that Mark was likely the oldest Gospel, the earliest written Gospel. But then you immediately start to see Pauline letters come in, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. There's some folks that insist that Galatians was actually the earliest letter we have from Paul. There's, again, you're talking about a couple 3-year difference here. Different people will have different interpretations. And we see the Gospel of Matthew come in, more Pauline letters, including Paul's letter to the Romans. James, some people date James as being far earlier than this, but you sort of get a feel for where, as the Gospels are being written and as Paul's letters especially are being written. There's some, when they're grouping these together, Paul in prison, we have a pretty good idea. Now here, again, in this list, Hebrews is being credited to Paul. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but there is a stretch where Paul was in prison writing to various churches that he planted. So when you see those grouped together, whether that date is specifically correct or not, we have a pretty good idea that those were written around the same time, based on Paul's own personal history. And we can see that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were written relatively lately, along with his gospel and the book of Revelation. So that just gives you a basic idea of kind of where those are. And again, I'll send that along with the post-class email as well, so you guys have an idea of sort of when those letters were written relative to each other. I think that's probably more important than the specific dates. So that's an overview of the letters. I'm going to take a second here and invite you guys all to unmute yourself if you'd like. If you have any questions, thoughts, quibbles, queries, complaints, feel free to share those. And then we'll get into some of the individual letters here in just a minute. So by all means, does anybody have any questions? No? All right. Let's dive into some of the individual letters then. So we'll start with Paul's letters. Again, I said earlier that Paul was responsible for 13 of the 21 epistles, or Paul is credited with 13 of the 21 epistles. We know for sure, scholars believe they know for sure, that Paul wrote 7 of them. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon are all pretty universally agreed upon as those are Paul, absolutely 100% Paul. There's 3 different letters, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, and Ephesians, that there's mixed opinion. There are some people that absolutely insist that Paul wrote those, and there are some people that absolutely insist that it was a student of Paul or somebody, Paul and Paul's confidants. When we get to the pastoral epistles, which is 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, scholars are fairly sure that Paul didn't actually write those. There are some folks that will say that he did, but the consensus is that those were written by somebody, again, even if it wasn't Paul writing it, it was somebody who had learned from Paul, because the theology and the ideas are very similar. When they distinguish who wrote what, it's more about the consistency of the language. Here's how we know Paul wrote. And then there's some phrasings and some different ways of saying things. The Greek is slightly different, whatever it is. Now, that could also be a factor of Paul having somebody write it for him. Here, I'm going to dictate this letter to this individual, and that individual writes it down, but maybe paraphrases some things. So it's not necessarily in Paul's voice, but it's still Paul's idea there. I'll show you one other graphic here for a minute that kind of gets at this point. And you'll see this is actually from a British conference. But they took a vote, and the blue is people that think that Paul wrote the letters. The letters are listed along the bottom here. Red are people that think that Paul didn't write that letter. Gray is people who are voting unsure. So again, you see those 7s: Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. You can see those there, and then Philemon and Philippians. You can see maybe there's just one person that said maybe not on Philippians, but you can see there's strong consensus that he wrote those. You can see the Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, that there's some disagreement about whether he wrote those or not. And then when you get to the pastoral epistle here, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, you can see it's a very small group of people that think that he actually wrote those. This graphic also includes Hebrews. You see nobody actually would say in that vote that he wrote Hebrews. Some folks will say they're unsure, but most of the folks think he didn't actually write those. And again, I'll send that graphic along after the class. But it just gives you an idea, again, of the variety. And we've talked about this throughout the whole series, right? That there are times where books have somebody's name involved or are credited to have been written by somebody. And scholarly research and investigation reveals that person probably didn't write those. It was either somebody connected to them or somebody that was attributing it to them to try and gain that kind of authority or try to gain that kind of credibility to what it is that they were writing, which doesn't necessarily negate what's being written there. It just means we have to understand that there's filters we have to wash things through, right? That when it says this is Paul saying this, well, Paul might have said some of the things in Ephesians, perhaps. Maybe he dictated that letter, but we're really not sure he put pen to paper and wrote that specific letter, which doesn't, again, negate everything that's said in between it. We just have to hold stuff more loosely. The stuff that we have we're fairly confident that people wrote, we can hold on to the ideas in there maybe a little bit tighter than we would in other stuff that maybe he did right, maybe he didn't write. In Paul's letters, there are common themes. Perhaps the most common theme in all of his letters, the idea of unity. He stressed unity all the time. Now, some of that comes from just historical circumstances. This was a very early movement in Judaism and spreading into Gentile areas. So in order for that to survive, people had to hang together, right? Very early on, Christianity was persecuted by the Roman Empire. It was even more important for folks to hang together rather than be spread out. So unity is a big theme of his. So is love. John gets credit more than Paul does for talking about love. And understandably so. When we talk about John, that's the theme of John, is God's love for humanity. But it's also a strong theme in Paul's letters, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Perseverance is another major theme in Paul. And again, that comes often from the persecution, which Paul understood as well as anybody, because Paul's early career was persecuting Christians. Before his conversion event, he persecuted Christians. So he knows just how difficult it can be to persevere through that kind of persecution. So that becomes a strong theme of his as well, as is fidelity to Christ, just your loyalty to God in the face of adverse circumstances. So I want to touch on, let's see what time we got here. I want to touch on at least two of Paul's letters. I've got notes on three. I'm not sure we're going to have time for all three, but I want to start with Romans because that was the video that I had you guys watch. Romans is considered Paul's magnum opus. It contains the most and the deepest exploration of Paul's theology of any of his letters. If you want to know what Paul thought about being a Christian, Romans is an excellent place to start. It's also an excellent place to have that kind of context that I talked about earlier, because there's a lot of things in Romans that can leave somebody who's new to the Bible going cross-eyed very quickly. It's not one of the first books I'd have people read, put it that way, if they were fresh to the Bible. I wouldn't start them on Romans. But when we're talking about Paul, if we're specifically trying to explore what Paul thought and how Paul taught, Romans is as good as any. Paul wrote, interestingly, it's one of the few letters Paul wrote that was to a church that he didn't found. Most of the letters he wrote were to churches that he planted and that he was trying to support and trying to encourage. But Romans is a different animal. He was writing to Romans, both from a pastoral perspective, because there were things going on in that church in Rome that he was trying to address, problems and issues. We'll talk about that in a second. But he was also trying to finance a trip to Spain when he wrote this letter. That was his next goal. He had taken these three massive missionary journeys. Now he was trying to go towards Spain and branch out in that direction. And he was hoping that the church in Rome would help him fund that particular trip. So that was sort of the thing that kickstarted this letter. So to quickly kind of summarize the history that was going on here, there was a period of time where Jews were kicked out of Rome, including Jews that were followers of Jesus. And so for a few years there, as the Jews were kicked out of Rome because they were somebody that the emperor could blame for whatever was going on at that particular time, the Roman church was purely Gentile, right? There were no Jews there to be part of the church. They were there initially when that church was founded, were kicked out for several years. And when they come back, when they were allowed back, they found a church that had changed significantly, right? Because it was a church being run at that point, particularly by Gentiles. And it reignited this argument that we see plenty in Acts and in other texts as well. This idea of, do you have to be a Jew in order to follow Jesus, right? In order to be a Christian, do you need to be a Jew first? And so when Paul writes to these folks, he's stressing unity between Jews and Gentiles. He's pointing out that all of us, Jew or Gentile, are sinner before God, and that in fact, the Gentiles may have the advantage because the Jews at least had the law. The Jews at least knew what the rules were. before they broke them and sinned. The Gentiles didn't have the law in front of them, so they didn't know what they were doing. And really what we're talking about here is this idea of which rules do you have to follow, right? Jesus came very much to establish a way of living life that really wasn't about a checklist of rules. It was about a posture of your heart, about how you were postured towards other people. How do you approach other people? How do you think of other people? What drives how you treat other people? That was what Jesus was really drilling at, not necessarily if you do this, and you do this, you check off those boxes, you're good to go. And that was the worry between the Jews and the Gentiles, because the Jews said, no, we have these rules that we have to follow. And the Gentiles are like, that's not really what Jesus was about. And so it was finding a way to bring those two communities together and show them that the idea is that we are all sinners before God, that we're all in need of God's grace. The book of Romans is often used to talk about ideas of personal, individual salvation and justification. And that kind of misses the point, because again, Paul's driving at this unity idea so much, that the idea is that we are all together working to bring about God's kingdom here on earth, that how we behave, how we conduct ourselves in relationship to each other as a community and relationship to the community around us is what drives people to find interest in why are we doing these things that, it would seem to be against our own interests and for other people's interests. Well, we do that because that's what Jesus taught us to do. Jesus taught us this idea of self-sacrificial love. And so when we sacrifice on our own behalf for the sake of others, and others are wondering why we do that, that's the entree into talking about the gospel. This is how the entire kingdom of God is supposed to work. If everybody's sacrificing and giving to everybody else, everybody has what everybody needs. And that sounds simplistic on the surface, but it's really, really difficult when you get it into practice. And that's what these folks are trying to do as these epistles are being written, is work out, how does this work practically, where I make sure I have enough to be able to survive, but I'm also making sure everybody else has enough to survive too. That's not always a straight linear path. But when we're talking about individual justification and individual salvation, that takes us away from this idea of being connected to each other. And that was so important and so huge to Paul, that I stress that when I teach from Romans, that these notions of personal, individual salvation, individual resurrection are good things to know about, but it's in a context of this community idea. It's far more important that we're part of a community than we are. Am I personally saved, or are we as people behaving as those who are saved by God? I'm going to skip Galatians for a minute just because it's starting to get a little bit late, and we're going to go to the book of 1 Corinthians. I talked earlier, by the way, about commentaries. For my last class, we had to buy this guy. This is just on the book of 1 Corinthians. That alone. The entire thing is on 1 Corinthians, which is, this is insane. This is way too big, way bigger than any particular commentary needs to be. By contrast, we saw how long Isaiah is. The commentary I have on Isaiah is this guy. Now that's paperback versus hardcover, but still, Isaiah is much, much longer than 1 Corinthians is. So just by way of, when you really want to get into it, get on that shelf. When you really want to get into it, there's plenty to be said about all of these letters. But 1 Corinthians is a good one, because you can go on and on about the church at Corinth for a very, very long time. It's one of Paul's favorite churches. We know he loved them dearly because he wrote to them more than he wrote to any of the churches. They also drove him more nuts than any other church that he had to deal with. Basically, you can sum up Paul's letters to the Corinthians like this. Paul's saying, yeah, all those things that you guys are doing, stop doing those. That's basically the breadth and width of his two letters to the Corinthians. What you have to remember about the church at Corinth is that in that city, status was extraordinarily important. People were constantly trying to measure themselves against each other. And you'll see that throughout the letters. There's one particular stretch where Paul's talking about spiritual gifts. And the church at Corinth was clearly battling about which gifts were worth more than the other. If I can prophesy, does that make me better than somebody who teaches? If I have the power to heal people, does that make me better than somebody who has evangelism as their spiritual gift, whatever it is? So they're constantly trying to measure each other against there. And Paul's constantly waving his hands and going, guys, knock it off. Don't do that. That's not the point, because you're creating divisions within yourself. And the whole point here is we're supposed to be one body of Christ. We're supposed to be together in this. We're supposed to be working together for the benefit of other people. And that sort of plays itself out there's a famous section in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And you've heard it a million times. If you've ever been to a Christian wedding, you've heard Love is patient. Love is kind. Da, 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 da. There's a whole section there that Paul talks about love. And ironically, because we hear that all the time at weddings, Paul wasn't talking about marital love there. He wasn't talking about the marital relationship. He was talking about the relationship in the church. And what you see there is there's three things to start where Paul's talking about what love is. And then he goes into 8 things that he's talking about. Here's what love isn't. And what he's specifically doing in those things is naming things that were going on in the Corinthian church. These things that you guys are doing, they're not love. And that's the whole point. If you have all the gifts in the world, if you know all of the scripture in the world, that's great. But if you don't turn around and aren't inspired to love other people through that and behave in love towards other people, including people in your church and in your community, then none of that matters. We see that in the very last line of that section, chapter 13, verse 13, Paul writes, and now faith, hope, and love remain, these 3, and the greatest of these is love. And that's Paul's focus, like I said, on love, that the whole idea of being a follower of Jesus is shifting your posture from here's how the rest of the world looks at everybody else. And that's grab what you can, when you can, get yours because everybody else is trying to get theirs, and the heck with everybody else. Jesus is trying to shift to somebody saying, no, God will bless you with all you need. Help those who have less than you. It's that posture of self-sacrificial love that Jesus is constantly talking about. And that was how Jesus lived out his life. It's the example that he lived out for us. And Paul's picking up on that there. So we'll press pause there for a second. Those are the 2 Pauline letters I want to talk about. There's 2 other letters I want to mention as well, but I want to give you guys a chance. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, wave, do whatever you want if you've got any questions. So the next one we're going to talk about is the book of Hebrews, which I mentioned earlier is the one epistle that we don't really know who wrote it. Some, as we talked about, will think that it's authored by Paul. I don't think there's anywhere near enough evidence to actually support that. So we generally go with the idea that Hebrews is just anonymously written. What we do know about it is that it was written to a Jewish audience. There's a lot of assumed knowledge of the Old Testament. There's a lot of things that are mentioned in the book of Hebrews that aren't explained, like we see in other New Testament texts where they talk about Jewish traditions and Jewish writings and are very careful about explaining what they mean. So the idea is that we're assuming that this is written to a primarily Jewish audience. It walks through the story. It walks Jewish Christians through the story of Israel in a manner which it's trying to show how the story of Israel, the story of God's people, culminates, has its climax in the life and ministry of Christ. So I asked you to read chapter 11. The reason I asked you to read chapter 11 of Hebrews is because the very first verse in there to me is hugely foundational. And I want to read it for you first before we get into the theology of it. But it says, chapter 11, verse 1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And the reason I zero in on this particular verse, one of the big things that I think it's important for people to understand is that doubt and questions are not an anathema to faith. I think they're actually the fuel of faith. The idea is that when we're asking questions, when we're wrestling with doubts, we're not blaspheming God. We're actually engaging God in a different way. Obviously, we can engage God through prayer, but a lot of prayer can be, we saw in the Psalms, remember, prayers of lament, prayers of people asking God, what in the world is going on right now? That's the kind of doubts, that's the kind of questions that people still have. But, I grew up in a tradition that said you can't have those, that's somehow blasphemy, that somehow lessens God if I'm asking questions or if I'm doubting things. I don't think God is so fragile that he can't answer a few questions. I don't think that God is so brittle that a few doubts are going to break him. I think God wants to engage with us in our doubts. He wants to not to shame us for them. He wants to engage. He wants us to bring those questions and bring those doubts to him. He wants to take us from that which is difficult for us to see and help us make it more visible. And we see, if you just go a couple of verses later, in chapter 11, verse 3, it says, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. It's this movement from our lack of understanding to a deeper understanding. We never understand everything about God. We're finite, fallible human beings. God is this infinite, perfect being. There's no way for us to ever wrap our mind totally around God. But as Steve likes to say, and it's a great quote from Richard Rohr, that doesn't make God unknowable. That makes God endlessly knowable. It means for the entirety of our journey with God, there are more things to know. There are more things to understand. There are deeper understandings to be achieved. And we see that there in this letter to the Hebrews, which makes it, at least that chapter for sure, one of my favorites. And finally, I want to talk about the letter to James, or the letter from James, which also contains one of my favorite little bits of theology. It's assigned, I signed James because it's a shorter letter. If you want to read through the whole thing, I think it's about 4 chapters. It's not very difficult to get through. It's pretty easily digestible. And it's important to remember who this particular author was, right? This is Christ's brother writing well, I'll talk about who he's writing to in a minute. This is Christ's brother, James, who wasn't with Christ at the beginning. We don't see at the very beginning James numbered among the apostles, but by the time we get into Acts, James is a very important figure, which means he sort of figured it out and realized that this brother of his, stepbrother of his, however they were related, was on to something and was clearly, preaching the word of God. And so he became a passionate advocate of Jesus's way of living life. It says early on in the letter that it's written to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And this is something we've actually touched on in the past, right? We're talking about the 12 tribes of Israel, obviously. The dispersion, remember, is when we were talking about the Babylonian exile, and that there were some folks that came home to Judah and to Jerusalem, and some stayed out and away. Those are the Jews in the diaspora, it's called, the dispersion. So this is also writing to a Jewish audience, but it's writing to a Jewish audience that isn't centered in Jerusalem and in Judah. These are Christians that are spread out. James is connecting this idea of the Jewish dispersion to Christians that are not necessarily living right in the Holy Land. He's conflating those two things together. So I assigned you chapter 2, and it's because when we, as people that are attending a Protestant church, we follow a very Lutheran idea that we are saved through grace alone by faith alone. That may be a phrase that you've heard. Saved through grace alone by faith alone. That's Martin Luther. And so we get to chapter 2 of James, and it says in verse 17, so faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Well, wait a minute. I thought we were saved by faith alone, or saved by grace alone through faith alone. So there's this constant war about, are we more Paul people, which is that idea of faith alone, where that's where the idea with the grace alone, faith alone comes from, or are we more James people and works matters? Catholics would argue that, yes, obviously grace is the primary force, but works matter too. And the folks that want to push back against Catholics are saying, no, the Protestants are saying, no, it's totally grace. There's nothing you can do to earn it. No matter what your works are, it's absolutely 100% grace that factors into our salvation. And there are historical reasons for that. There were abuses happening in the Catholic Church around the time of the Reformation that had to do with earning your way to heaven. If you paid the church some money, that would be your works to earn your way to heaven. And Protestants were trying to put up a wall against that and say, no, absolutely not. It's 100% of God's grace. There's nothing you can do to earn it. No matter how much money you give the church, that doesn't matter. It's all about, God's grace and your faith. And the truth, as with most things, probably lies somewhere in between, right? The way that I like to teach it is that I think of them as consecutive, not conflicting. That our faith in God gives us access to God's saving grace, right? God's grace comes whether we deserve it or not. We just choose to buy in and say yes to it. But in choosing to buy in and say yes to it, we start to understand, or we hopefully start to understand, what a tremendous gift that is. How much we can never actually earn that grace, that we will consistently screw up in our lives. That's just our nature in a fallen world. And yet God still loves us through that sin, through those screw ups, and is constantly renewing and restoring us and bringing us to salvation. And when you get a hold of that idea of what a tremendous gift that is, I think that motivates us to do things, right? That the reason that we do the kind of missional work that we do, the reason that we do the kind of volunteering that we do, is because we realize how blessed we are, how much we don't necessarily deserve God's grace and God's love, and it's given freely to us anyway. And when you feel that, I think it sort of motivates you to turn around and pour that out. We talk about paying it forward all the time, right? When we realize all the debt that God's paid for us, when we realize all the grace that God's given us and all the love that God's given us, it fills you up to a point where you just want to pour that out on somebody else. And so when James is talking about, that faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead, what I think he's really getting at is, if you feel you're a person of faith and you don't feel that motivation to aid others, to give to others, to pour that love that's important to you out to other people, maybe it's time to go back and talk about faith again and try to understand what that faith is and what your faith is actually in, what that grace is all about. because it's supposed to work itself out through you. That's the idea, is God pours love into us so that we pour it out to one another. And I think that's more what James is probing at. But it's just a little interesting bit of history there. I wish I had more time. There's plenty more letters to dig into. I'll give you just a couple of quick notes. John 1 through 3 are shorter letters, easy to kind of crank their way through. They do a remarkable job of talking about the centrality of love in the life of Christians. Again, I think love is an important theme in Paul. I think John is one I think hammers it home even more. Philemon is an interesting letter, also short, but it has an interesting history when it comes to American slavery. If you read through it, and you read it as somebody who for some reason would want slavery to still exist, you can see there how people went in that direction with it. I think now, as we see slavery as a completed anathema, when you read through that letter, you see Paul's objection to it, and you see Paul also acceding to the reality that he couldn't stop it in that particular place and time. And so there's a very conflicting history as to how that's been used over the course of American Christianity. But the letter is essentially him asking a slave owner to free his slave, which I think hints at Paul's understanding that slavery is not a part of God's agenda for the world. And the pastoral epistles, this will be the last thing, and then we'll open it up to question and discussion. The pastoral epistles, which again are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, do offer tremendous encouragement, especially for pastors. There's some questionable theology in there, and I want to highlight that again. A lot of the times that you find misogynistic theology, women shouldn't be allowed to teach or talk in church. A lot of times when you find anti-inclusive theology, you'll find it in those pastoral letters. And again, when we talked about which ones were least likely to have been written by Paul, these are the ones that we're talking about. And that's why I encourage people to hold a lot of the stuff in those particular letters very, very loosely and really try to dig into the time and place of their writing. Where were they written to? What was going on in that time and place? I think really helps us contextualize some of the questionable theology in there. So that's the epistles. And that's going to be it for this week. For those of you watching on YouTube, thank you so much for being with us and for watching. And we'll open it up for questions here in just a moment. Next week, remember, we're talking about the book of Revelation. So hopefully you can join us for that.